Welcome back to another episode of Signals Over Noise, the show where we take headlines from around the world and strip it of the headlines and the partisan punditry. That way you can see what actually matters. And a quick update on the show before we get into our topic tonight. Since we started this project over a month ago, it's been listened to in over 60 different countries. In the last week alone, 300,000 people have tuned into our updates, and none of that would be possible without all of you. So thank you again for your continued support. Tonight's episode is going to deep dive the topic that is on everybody's mind. That is, of course, the ongoing war in the Middle East. Now that we're a week in and some of the shock and awe has worn off, we're starting to see signals that are pointing us in the direction this conflict might go. But before we can talk about where we're going or where we're at right now, we have to discuss how we got here in the first place. And I'm not talking about February 28th when these strikes begun, nor am I talking about the protests in January. To understand how we got here, we have to travel back to 2015. When we first heard of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the JCPOA or the Iranian nuclear deal. Now, you might have heard of this deal before, and depending on where you've heard about it from, you could either think that this was a deal in which the United States gave pallets of cash to the country of Iran, a fascist dictatorship in the Middle East, or you might think it was one of the greatest pieces of foreign policy in the 21st century. Neither of which encapsulates the entirety of this deal. And to understand this conflict, we have to understand this deal. What the JCPOA did was, in exchange for Iran allowing inspectors at its nuclear facilities to ensure that they were not enriching uranium at weapons grade, the United States and a coalition of other countries reduced sanctions and lifted some others, while also returning assets that had been frozen over the last several decades to Iran. And that's oftentimes where we get that idea that we just gave them pallets of cash. Because in essence, we did. But it was their cash that had been seized over several different decades. It's a common misconception in foreign policy that when a country seizes something from another as a part of international sanctions, that money simply goes into the general fund. It's not. It's taken and it's held at Treasury and other departments while we wait to see what happens with that country. That was 2015. And something else that the JCPOA did was it lifted important economic sanctions that had suppressed the economy of Iran for several decades. And between 2015 and 2018, the country of Iran saw some economic prosperity that it had not seen since the early 1970s, and the economy started to grow. And then everything changed in 2018 when President Trump's first administration unilaterally withdrew the United States from participation in the JCPOA. Now, the administration at the time claimed that this was because it was, quote, the worst deal that had ever been negotiated, end quote. And whereas there may be some merits to that argument, the effects were immediate. Following the United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iran stopped allowing international inspectors into its nuclear facilities. And that increased speculation that Iran was beginning to enrich uranium up to weapons-grade capabilities. And that's a big deal, because that's when we start to see Israel sounding the alarm over Iran's production of weapons-grade uranium and their ability to build a bomb, so to speak. What's important about the 2018 withdrawal is that there was nothing to follow up or replace it. Another deal was not negotiated, and sanctions went back into place. And that started a slow and crippling collapse of all of the prosperity that had been built up in Iran over the last several years. And that leads us to January of 26, when a wave of protests kicked off inside of Iran. And I'm not going to go too in-depth on those protests because we did an episode a couple of weeks ago that covered them. But to give you the cliff notes, the protests did not start with political instability. Instead, the protests started when merchants in Tehran and other cities around the country began to protest the economic instability and the lack of prosperity inside of Iran. And that led to the political protests that Iran quickly, swiftly, and violently cracked down on. And that's when we started to see the numbers, first from Iranian state TV, which said that 3,000 dissenters had been killed, and then international organizations, which claimed 6,000 to 12,000 protesters had been killed, and culminated in the last couple of days with this administration telling us that tens of thousands of protesters had been killed. In January is when we started to see the cracks in the political stability of the regime in Iran. And that presented an opportunity to the enemies of the regime. And they capitalized on that opportunity. Before negotiations had even begun in Geneva over Iran's nuclear program and their ballistic missile capability, a carrier strike group was already heading towards the country of Iran, and that was the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. And then, only a week or two later, we were notified that a second carrier strike group was heading towards the country, that being the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. And if that sounds odd, that two carrier strike groups would be operating in such close proximity to each other, it's because it is. And only a few weeks prior to that, there were two other carrier strike groups operating in close proximity off the coast of Venezuela. And I think we all know how that ends. It ends with a special military operation that captures the president of Venezuela, President Maduro. So we started to see some pattern recognition there. Two carrier strike groups off the coast of Venezuela, now two carrier strike groups heading towards the country of Iran. And that kicked off negotiations in Geneva between Iran and the United States, and it centered around their nuclear program and also their ballistic missile program. And I want to highlight that. When we added the additional restriction as part of the negotiations on ballistic missile capability, we should have known from the start that was a non-starter. The entire deterrence strategy of the nation of Iran since its founding has been centered on ballistic missile capability. Drones only started popping up in the last couple of years. So while diplomats were in Geneva debating on enrichment of uranium and ballistic missile capability, posture was beginning to take form in the Middle East. And ultimately, it culminates on February 28th of 2026, when the United States, in a coalition with Israel, launches the first wave of kinetic strikes. And that leads us to the past week or so. That first wave of kinetic strikes struck over 1,000 targets inside of Iran. And it centered on military infrastructure. The first major targets that we started to see pop up in the targetry chain were air defense systems, ballistic missile production, drone production, and naval assets in the region. It has since been expanded to also include the internal security apparatus, command and control structures, civilian leadership inside of the country, and of course, the launchers that have been responsible for Iran's retaliation. And speaking of Iran's retaliation, this has been an unprecedented retaliation by Iran. Several different countries in the region have been struck, including UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Cyprus, of all places. It is the largest regional war in the Middle East to date. And that is important because it also aligns with Iran's deterrence plan in the event that the Ayatollah was killed. Their strikes are meant to put as much pressure on the Gulf states that have supported the United States' military apparatus in the Middle East as much as possible, because they believe that by putting pressure on these other Arabic nations, that they can help to reduce the escalation by Israel and the United States. whether through limiting access to their airspace, to expelling their diplomats, to expelling the entire United States military from their country if it ever gets to that point. And then that leads us now into where we're at right now, which is ending the first week of a major conflict that has taken the lives of 7 Americans, thousands of Iranians, and dozens of Israelis, not to mention a handful of other citizens from different countries around the region. Certainly one of the bloodiest conflicts in recent memory in this region. And speaking of how bloody this conflict has been, the opening salvo killed Ayatollah Khamenei, which was the supreme leader of Iran, and he had been the supreme leader since the revolution in the 1970s. And that's our first signal that I want to talk to you about tonight, which is Iran's cessation of leadership. It's been pretty speculative over the last week on who was going to lead Iran after the supreme leader's death. But as of today, when we were recording this episode, which is Sunday, the 8th of March, we do know who the next supreme leader is, Mojtaba Khamenei. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that is the son of the late Ayatollah Khamenei. And that's really important for us to focus in on, because he's in his 50s, he's not a senior cleric, and he's never held a high political office inside of Iran. His rise to being the supreme leader of this country is rather untraditional as far as this nation goes. However, it is not surprising in the slightest that he has been chosen to lead Iran. For the last several decades, he has been the gatekeeper to his father's office in Tehran. He's been a political power broker, linking the IRGC and the clerics of the country. And speaking of the IRGC, that's probably where he's done his largest and most influential cultivation of power, is with the IRGC. And that's important because the IRGC is the most powerful paramilitary apparatus in the Middle East. And his linkage with the IRGC goes far beyond just connecting them to the clerics of the country. In 2009, he led the crackdown on protests with the internal security apparatus, linking him directly to the bloodshed of this regime. Rather than another cleric being appointed or a politician from their political elite, instead what we got was an IRGC commander who's been operating in the shadows for decades. And that tells us one very clear signal, that it is highly unlikely that the regime is going to destabilize from a security aspect over the next several weeks. In fact, they will probably consolidate gains made over the next couple of weeks, and that'll bring the war into an entirely new phase. The second defining signal that we've seen these last couple of weeks was the air campaign against Iran. And I want to focus on the air campaign a little bit more here, because in the opening days of the war, we saw several hundred ballistic missile launches, and we saw several hundred drones being flown into targets around the Middle East. We've received daily updates almost from CENTCOM that has showed the gradual degradation of their capabilities. The most recent one we saw was that since the start of the war, ballistic missile launches were down 90% and drone launches were down 83%. And many people have taken this to be the complete degradation of Iran's capabilities to wage war on other Gulf states. But when we make that assumption, we ignore some critical facts. That every single day, UAE, Qatar, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia claim to have continued to have shot down several ballistic missiles and dozens of drones, showing us that Iran still very much has this capability. And there are several facts that can be all true at the same time. Over this air campaign we probably did degrade Iran's ability to launch ballistic missiles and drones significantly, especially if CENTCOM's number that they presented, which was 300, is accurate. Because if we truly did destroy 300 launchers over the last week, well, at the start of the war, they were only estimated to have 450 launchers, which means we've significantly degraded their capabilities. However, significantly degraded their capabilities does not mean the war is over. In fact, the reduction of launches could probably be attributed to conservation on Iran's part of their ballistic missile capacity and capability to further deter a ground invasion of the country. But moving outside of the air campaign, we have our third signal, which has been the regional spillover. And we've talked at length already of the strikes on several different Gulf states. But there are a handful of those Gulf states that I really want to focus on, because some matter more than others, especially the countries of Oman, Qatar, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, because those traditionally have supported Iran as having a good neighbor mentality or mindset. They haven't really taken a hard stance, unlike Saudi Arabia, which is the ideological opposite of Iran. So when I've started to hear reporting that Saudi Arabia quietly encouraged the United States to do this, I'm not surprised about it, because Iran is part of a Shia Muslim sect, whereas Saudi Arabia is a part of a Sunni Muslim sect. And that would be like comparing Protestant Christians to the Roman Catholic Church. They're always going to be at odds with each other. There's a significant difference in doctrine and belief that wars are being fought over between these two different sects, which is not dissimilar to the Protestant Reformation hundreds of years ago. But that is besides the fact, because the regional spillover doesn't just include the Gulf states. I mentioned earlier that the island nation of Cyprus had been hit, specifically an RAF base. Cyprus is in the Mediterranean, showing the true reach of this conflict. And outside of that, the United States, using a submarine, sunk an Iranian vessel in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka. And that's really important, because it shows that this conflict has spread out thousands of kilometers from its initial start point. So it's no longer just a regional conflict, it's quickly approaching the global conflict status. But speaking of Sri Lanka, there's another important signal that came out of that sinking, and that is the external power dynamics that are at play here. And I want to define what I mean by external power dynamics, because that's our fourth signal for today. At surface level, this may seem like the United States and Israel getting back at Iran for the decades that it has sponsored terrorism all around the world. This may seem like just a regional police action or special military operation, but using the own language of the United States' national security strategy and national defense strategy, there's only a handful of ways that this war can be justified using this administration's own language. And we can't justify it with southern border security, which is the first line of effort, or Western Hemisphere stability, which is the second. We can, however, though, see clear parallels to the third line of effort, which is deterring China in the South China Sea through strength. And I know what you're probably thinking. How could this conflict possibly deter China when this is the Persian Gulf thousands of miles away? Well, unlike Venezuela, which only supplied around 2 to 4% of China's oil imports, Iran supplies roughly between 14 and 16% of China's global oil imports. 80% of all of Iran's oil exports went to the country of China. And that shows something important, especially when it comes to China, that most of China's oil imports come from countries that are sanctioned by the West, specifically their oil exports. China gets the majority of its oil from countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, which face heavy sanctions by the United States and its allies. And this conflict has done two things. First, it has reduced Iran's ability to act as a proxy in the event that the United States intervenes in a potential war in the Indo-Pacific. It limits the ability for that proxy, China's proxy Iran, to open up a second front in what would already be a devastating conflict. The other important signal from this past week was where we sank that ship in the Indian Ocean, which is right off the coast of Sri Lanka, because where we sank that ship also is almost right on top of the main maritime shipping route for what is 70% of China's oil imports. That's sending a message, and that message isn't meant to be sent to Iran. It's almost certainly meant to be sent to China, that we have the global reach to impact your global oil imports. Doesn't matter how many thousands of miles separate our mainland from yours. We can reach out and touch you. And that is a very dangerous signal to be sending at a time like this. Outside of the United States and its great power competition, Iran has been receiving support from Russia. Specifically, open source reporting tells us it's targetry, and that's really important because it shows a major escalation by Russia, giving intelligence to the Iranians on where to strike to impact the United States the hardest. And the administration has downplayed this to this point, and that's okay. But it is definitely important for us to note that that is where Russia stands on this conflict. China, outside of our great power competition with them, also allowed 2 Iranian cargo ships linked to their ballistic missile program to leave a port in Galon, carrying what we believe to be chemical precursors that are important to Iran's ballistic missile program. Now, usually, during a time like this, with significant escalation around the world, China would do anything in their power to stall those ships from leaving their port. Instead, they just allowed them to leave, which shows us that Beijing is giving its quiet nod of support to the regime in Tehran. Probably the most important signal tonight, though, is not great power competition. It's not the secession of Iranian leadership. It's not even the air campaign. One of the most important signals is something that is being talked about in the media. And I wanted to take a moment to address it here tonight. And that's the interceptor problem. Over the last week, we have seen hundreds of interceptor missiles fired at Iran's ballistic missiles and drones in the region. And that's really important, because prior to this conflict breaking out in December of 2025, Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, published a bombshell report that raised red flags on the United States' industrial capacity to build interceptor missiles. Using information from the war last summer, they anticipated that the United States would face a critical shortage of interceptors if they participated in a sustained regional conflict where Patriot missile systems, either PAC-1s, 2s, or 3s, or the THAAD, which is the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, or SEM 3s or 6s, which are part of the Aegis naval interceptor system. And right now, the response from the administration has been, oh, well, most of those missiles were intercepted by our partners in the Gulf. That may be true, but one important fact to remember is that the industrial base that supplies our partners in the Gulf is the same that supplies the United States. That most of those missiles, regardless if they're THAAD, Patriot, or SM-3s or 6s, are built by companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And we've already shown that our capacity to build those far is under what our adversary's capacity to build ballistic missiles is. So in essence, this creates a war of attrition where all the defenders have to do is continue to fire ballistic missiles until the attackers don't have any interceptors left, or vice versa. That interceptor problem is not going to go away. And what we need to watch is not necessarily what does the industrial capacity do over the next couple of months or years. Instead, it's where do we pull resources from to continue to meet the demand inside of the Middle East. Those are our 5 defining signals. And when you pair them all together, it shows us that the likelihood that this war ends in the 3 to 6 week time period that the administration is given is astronomically low. That this is most likely going to be a prolonged conflict. And if it's not a prolonged conflict, it will most likely not end with the political objectives that the administration has set forth. But that should be no surprise to anybody. The United States in the last 30 years has failed to meet many of its political objectives. I want to make something very clear, which is that we met a lot of other great objectives while we were in the Middle East. Sure, when we went into Afghanistan, we destabilized the Taliban in rapid pace and time. And for the next 20 years, that country was a relatively free country where women and girls were able to attend school, even if the government fell to the Taliban again after the United States pulled out. And Iraq, for the most part, is a mostly free nation. And the Kurdish people of Iraq have their own semi-autonomous zone in the country, which is a far cry better than being gassed under Saddam's regime. And Syria right now is a transitioning democracy no longer under the control of Bashar al-Assad. So even if the United States failed to meet its political objectives, we did do some pretty great things while we were over there. And that's important to remember as this war continues on. Which brings us to a new section of the show. I want to talk about some of the noise you've been hearing. One of the largest pieces of noise out there has been the international reporting of U.S. casualties. And it's really shown how effective information operation campaigns can be, even in the United States. International media authorities, which I want to be clear on that, these international media authorities are typically linked back to Al Jazeera. They're typically linked to sympathetic Iranian reporters, and they almost always mirror what Tehran's casualty estimates are for the United States. And of course, Tehran would have no way of knowing. And that noise ignores a couple of key facts. First, that the United States has spent over $200 billion on air missile defense in the last 20 years. They seem to ignore the fact that the majority of these ballistic missiles were intercepted. The second fact they seem to ignore is that it would be impossible to hide the deaths of hundreds of U.S. service members, especially when you would consider that our major hospital for this conflict would be in Landstuhl, Germany. We would almost certainly see an increase of C-17's inter-theater medical evacuation platforms being used to carry casualties from the Middle East to Europe. And we just simply haven't seen that. Some people would counter what I just said with, well, Landstuhl decided to shut down its maternity ward, and that's indicating that they've got more casualties than they're letting on. No, that's common practice whenever the hospital is expected to see some sort of increase in casualties, especially in a conflict as large as this one. And the reason why that isn't so unsurprising is there are several different hospitals around Landstuhl where U.S. service members can take their wives or themselves to go and have their kids. It's that simple, really. The other noise we're hearing during this conflict right now is that if you choose to report this unbiasedly, then you either support the regime or you support the United States. And that's just simply not true either. Reporting all of the information and keeping the people up to date on the actual factual picture in the region creates realistic expectations for policymakers and the people of the United States. If we lie just to make the United States look better, or if we lie just to make Iran look better, or if we lie just to make Israel look better, then nobody is better off for it at all. Because anything we do after that has been built on a lie and will surely collapse under any amount of scrutiny. Before we close for tonight, I want to leave you with a handful of things to watch for. First, over the next couple of days, watch to see if there's a power consolidation in the IRGC, the internal security apparatus, and of course the Iranian armed forces, because that would indicate that the new supreme leader of Iran is doing exactly what we expect him to do, which is consolidate power before the next phase of the war. The second thing we need to watch is for an increase in U.S. posturing in the region. Do we send a third aircraft carrier? The third thing to watch is our Gulf partners. And we need to watch this one really closely, because if the campaign of pressure on our Gulf partners begins to bear fruits, then it would surely show up in restriction of airspaces for offensive operations. And it would show that the pressure campaign that Iran is placing on them is successful. And the last thing to watch, one of the most interesting parts of this conflict is what the Houthis in Yemen do. Almost every single proxy has gotten involved in this conflict. The two notably quiet ones have been Hamas and the Houthis. Hezbollah got involved and it started a ground force campaign by Israel into Lebanon. The Iraqi proxies got involved and it's shown up in U.S. strikes against those proxies. But the Houthis have only issued statements deterring Gulf partners from getting involved in offensive operations. And that's interesting because the Houthis have the capability and capacity to expand this war even further, but they haven't entered the war yet. So keep a close eye on what's happening in Yemen over the next several weeks. Until then, focus on the signals, ignore the noise. This is Signals Over Noise.